Welcome back to Media Apocalypse, our series about the threats facing journalism, news gathering, and the flow of information in our democracy. Our show is dedicated to exploring legal, technological, and practical solutions for preserving the press function. Our guest this week is Professor Penelope Abernathy, who is the Knight Chair of Journalism and Digital Media Economics at the University of North Carolina School of Media and Journalism. How are you, Penny?
I'm doing just fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. And I am going to start by asking you the following question. What is happening to the business of newspapers these days? And can you explain to our audience two terms that are in the literature? One is the idea of a news desert.
Right.
And the other is the idea of a ghost newspaper, which I assume is very spooky and frightening. But anyway, can you explain what's been happening and what role the ghost newspaper and the media desert play in this story?
Well, it's pretty easy to explain that what we're talking about is the loss of news. In fact, a very dramatic loss of local news over the last 15 years, and certainly it has been accelerating over the last 3 or 4 years. So it is scary. The loss of news is very scary because it's at the core of our democracy. We depend on an informed citizenry to make wise decisions about the quality of life decisions that will affect us. So my own definition of a news desert has grown and changed especially over the last 5 years. Initially, I was defined a news desert based on scholarly research that had been done among other places at UNC that found that a strong local news organization, especially a strong newspaper, was often the prime, if not the sole source of news and information for most mid-sized and small communities. That's because the regional television station didn't reach into that area. It's because you did not have a lot of digital outlets at that point that were reaching in there. And radio has gradually become more of an entertainment medium than a news medium, so to speak, except in very strange circumstances around large cities where you have news radio. So for me, a news desert was originally a smaller mid-sized community where there was not a local newspaper. What has changed over the last 10 to 15 years is a lot of research that has been done by other scholars who've begun to look at both the digital divide in this country as well as the economic divide and political divide in this country. So the FCC came out in the early teens of this decade with a list of what they considered to be critical information needs. It was 8 categories of news. And their whole notion was there were 2 real conundrums facing people who thought about getting local news, getting news into rural suburban areas. One was the content that was rapidly disappearing as the digital age kind of destroyed overnight in many ways the economic model that had supported local newspapers for more than a decade and a half. I mean, for more than 200 years, starting in the early 1800s. And then the other was this, the lack of what we call digital infrastructure, and it was more than the last mile. It was the last several miles, many miles, that did not cover many inner city neighborhoods or many rural or urban areas. So for me, the definition of a news desert has evolved to include not only a lack of content, a lack of news, but also a lack of access and availability to the digital highway so that you can readily access news or can readily get it in some kind of form that you can easily digest it and understand what's going on. So for me, a news desert is a community where residents have very limited access to the type of news and information that they need in order to make wise decisions about the quality of their lives or the quality of future residents. So if you look at what has happened, it is a combination both of not having digital outlets or in areas that lack infrastructure, not having resources to get information into people in those areas, and also many people not being able to afford the $200 that it costs to access 200 cable bills and cable and high-speed internet inside the cities. And of course, I live out in the country, 88 miles from Chapel Hill, and the only way I get high-speed internet is through an antenna that captures radio waves. The antenna, it looks like an old-fashioned antenna from the 1950s
Right.
that the alarm company sells, and the radio wave comes in on an antenna on the top of the tallest pine tree on my property, which of course you can imagine the pine tree often gets hit by lightning or something
Now, what
else.
you're telling me, yeah. Now, what you're
Yeah.
telling me, Penny, is a story about telecom policy. That is to say, you need the background infrastructure of broadband access, one way or the other,
Yeah,
to have newspapers even to be available.
Right.
Right. So the old problem was getting the newspapers out through the mail.
right.
And that's the post office. Well, that's been problems recently. But the new problem is getting broadband access. So in fact, the structure of broadband policy is just vital to the delivery of news.
Absolutely, and that's where I've become increasingly concerned, because what you have, let's think about the loss of news. You've had
Right.
the loss of news in two ways. We have lost roughly a fourth of the local newspapers that we had over the last 15 years, and most of those have been newspapers that were serving small and mid-sized communities.
Right.
Those are the very communities, whether it's suburbs, whether it's any inner city neighborhoods, or whether it's rural areas, rural crossroads, that do not have any other alternative means to get the local news that they need. So that's one way. So you lose a newspaper, you lose the reporter who's going to show up at the school board meeting,
Right.
who's going to show up at the planning board meeting. The other thing we have lost is we have lost more than half of the newspaper reporters and journalists that we had just a decade ago.
Now,
And
is
we
this
are-
what we mean? Is this what we mean by the ghost newspaper?
It is, and let me explain, because the ghost newspaper is actually a kind of encompassing term here. So
Yeah.
if you think, where have we lost most of the reporters? That has not been at the local newspaper. That has been at the state, metro, and regional newspaper. So think about it this way. The local newspaper basically told you what was happening in your own backyard.
Mhm.
The state, regional, and metro newspapers, which have lost, in many cases, much more than half of their reporting staff. They've lost much more, like 3/4 of the reporting staff they had in the 15 years ago. If you think about it that way, they're the ones that basically show you, if you live in a small community, how you're related and share the same problems and possibilities with people in another area or another region that you may not realize you're related to.
Right.
And so what they really do is take what's happening on the local level, build it into a much bigger piece that allows you to understand and also begin to grasp policies that can address those inequities, or policies that knit people together in a positive sort of way. So, you know, if you think about the loss of news, think about it in two ways. And what has really, I think, what that loss of news also means is back to that whole notion that you don't have any other means of getting the news in those communities that have lost newspapers, nor do you have ways of getting the news that is going to affect you on a state level.
Right. So the next two questions are going to be just tied to this. It's great because everything I'm saying is just tied to the same basic problem. So it would follow from what you're saying that the proposal many people made, which is newspapers should just get rid of all of their paper, printing, delivery trucks, and just go digital, is going to be inadequate for the reasons you just described.
It's going to be inadequate for those reasons, and it's going to be inadequate for another reason. So one of the things that I assumed, Jack, when you held a conference back in 2009, is if you could just get local newspapers to grasp the fact that the future was digital and go on and switch over, that it was going to help them create sustainable business models.
Right.
The problem is that even as late as 2014, you could see the trend beginning, but it wasn't until we started picking it up in these small and mid-sized communities at 2016. What you had was a kind of overnight erosion of any kind of possibility by these local news organizations of actually capturing digital revenue. By 2016, we found that as much as 75% of the digital revenue in most small and mid-sized markets was going to Google and Facebook. So that left every legacy and every startup to fight over what I basically call digital scraps. So it's like we've lost the historic business model that sustained local news for 200 years, and nothing has replaced it on the digital side. So, and what that means is you're left with citizens who depended on the newspaper, both the newspaper that was produced locally as well as the state regional newspaper that was still delivered in those areas. That's not there anymore, because as the state and regional papers have pulled back on circulation from these outlying areas,
Right.
that means they've slashed the reporting staff.
So I'm going to give you a crazy question, which is designed to basically put together a bunch of different ideas. So you mentioned in your interview in Columbia Journalism Review about a paper in Arkansas that basically said, we can't get people to pay for the subscriptions to digital. So what they did is they offered to buy them an iPad and give the iPad along with the digital subscription. Because in other words, they're shifting away from ad revenue and towards subscription revenue, but people wouldn't just pay the money for the subscription, so they wanted hardware. So they gave them some hardware. Now that idea that the future for most of these papers is going to be subscription revenue,
right,
and the idea that people will be not be very happy about shelling out money for subscription revenue, suggests several possibilities. One is the possibility this Arkansas paper did. How expensive is it to get a tablet? So you just give them a free tablet when they subscribe. So essentially, it's like selling. It's giving away the razor and making money on the blades.
Right.
The old idea.
Yeah.
The second possibility, though, which I wanted to ask you about, is this. Has anyone considered creating consortiums between hardware manufacturers, one, or broadband companies, two, and newspapers? So that is to say, this would create a new alliance between content deliverers and the content producers, but it would be different than the 20th century newspaper. That is, the idea is when you get your broadband, you get a subscription to the newspaper, or if you get a subscription to the newspaper, you get a discount on some hardware, a computer for your kid or the iPad. Has that been explored as a way of making this work?
Well, I think part of the issue gets back to how you perceive the world. I teach a class in digital media economics, and one of the things that hit me from the very beginning is when you're talking about news, you're talking about three separate functions. One, there's the creation of it, or production, the actual creation of the news. You typically have editors or publishers or someone putting it together, aggregating it, and then you distribute it. Now, the problem has been, I've found when I've talked with the tech companies, when I've talked with the telecom companies, they start out as distributors. That is an engineering problem, not a content creation. You talk to the journalists, they see only the content creation and think that the distribution will just happen normally. It's the kind of, if you build the field, they will play and they will come, right, to watch everybody play. And so there is kind of, I think, a reluctance in many ways to a natural protection reluctance that prevents kind of that collaboration. So, and I think that in many cases, both the telecoms as well as the tech companies have not really grappled with the fact that their content has been created by somebody else. They don't have to pay for it, and there's just not an example I can point to yet in which you're talking about that collaboration. I think it opens up a whole range of possibilities in terms of policies and things. to consider.
Worth exploring. We should talk about that later.
Yeah.
Sandra.
And questions I want to put a pin in for now about the various kinds of other partnerships that one might be urging newspapers and other significant news gatherers to entertain or get into. But I want to pick up a theme that you had in one of your recent reports, where you wrote that if we are going to thwart the continued rise of news deserts, we need to reimagine the journalistic mission.
Yep.
And then you go on to say, and business model for local news, use technology to develop new capabilities and craft new policies, address disparities that have given rise to the news desert. I want to focus a bit on the first part of that sentence. What do you see? Tell me what you mean by the need to reimagine journalistic missions, and then to just give you a hint as to where I would go after that. How does that affect, if these missions affect the business models that are available to newspapers?
One of the things that was the most startling to me was realizing where most of the loss of newspapers had occurred. And I guess, like most people, I went in assuming it was going to be in rural areas that was hard to distribute news to. In fact, what we found is that the poverty rate in communities that have lost newspapers often is 3 to 4 times what the poverty rate is in the U.S. as a whole. So where we have lost newspapers that were the sole, if not the only source of news and information for those communities, has been in economically struggling, marginalized communities. I think what happened in the latter part of the 20th century, as you had more and more newspapers form chains, and then the chains went public, is that you began to get a removal from the community, right? As the chains got larger and larger, you began to get multiple shareholders. So it wasn't just the family that owned the newspaper, it was the people who bought stock in the newspaper. And that moved very dramatically over the past 30 years from being an individual shareholder like you and me who say, oh, we like the New York Times, we like the journalism of the New York Times, so I'm going to buy stock in the New York Times, to institutional investors. And what do institutional investors prioritize over a journalistic mission? They prioritize the return to the shareholders. So you had a kind of erosion of that civic journalism mission that kind of characterized and went hand in hand with the business mission that many newspapers have had over the past 200 years in this country. I mean, you had to meet the needs and expectations of both the residents and readers of your paper as well as the advertisers. And as long as you were connected to what the needs and expectations of the community were and had a strong wall between what the advertising and journalism was, you were probably, if you were a strong news organization, doing a pretty good job. I think that what has happened over the last 30 years, especially as the return to shareholders began to dramatically fall off in the early aughts of this decade, is that you had an increasing emphasis on the profit motive. And what that has resulted in is, if the newspaper's not making any money, you've got several choices. You go in and try to cut costs in your way to profitability, or you say, okay, I'm either going to close it or I'm going to try to sell it to somebody. If I can't sell it to somebody, then I'm going to close it. And the result is you have the communities that need the information the most in order for its residents to make really good decisions about all the choices and trade-offs they have to make with limited resources. They are the very ones that have lost that kind of connection to the data, to the information, to the news that's going to help them make good decisions.
One of the things you talk about, in fact, you did a whole report on the media barons, if you will, although in fairness, I think some of the old line families who have been hardly better in years in terms of meeting what I hear the expectation is do I understand you to be saying really that the mission is to go back to what the mission was, and that is to serve the civic responsibilities or civic issues of the community? I don't want to, I know you outline in the reports a number of business model options.
Right.
I'm interested in whether or not you have any sense as to which you think is the most realistic in our current economic situation. One, two, keeping in mind the political divide that makes legislative action and economic support from government challenging. I took to heart one of the admonitions I think you put into one of your reports, a more recent one, which is, isn't it about time we stop collecting anecdotes and sort of sifting through and finding the ones that seem to have some universal import or possibility? So that's a lot in one overly long sentence, but if you could follow my drift.
I absolutely did. Thanks for asking too. In addition to looking at the loss of news, I've spent the last decade looking at what kind of models might survive and where, because we have tons of case studies. And the real key is trying to figure out what Jack asked. But how relevant and how is the experience in Arkansas with the iPad, and can it be duplicated in other markets, right? So what made that one work? What are the lessons to learn? What I've found is that if you are in a community that has at least, your news organization is located in a community that has at least average to above average, either economic or growth prospects in terms of population, and you have a publisher or owner who has local autonomy in order to meet the needs and expectations of that community, then you have at least an average chance of developing both a for-profit or a nonprofit, or let's say a hybrid of the two, right? The real issue is you're not going to have 20% margins, 30% margins like you had in the past, but you have enough to create a newsroom that is fulfilling its civic journalistic mission, which I would argue, because you have First Amendment protections, that is should be your first and most your true North Star from what you need to start out with. How do I fulfill that? And so there are lots of options. I want to get back to what I said just a minute ago. Where I am very, very concerned is with the economically struggling communities, because not only are there no very limited for-profit options in terms of probably no retail base, of a very poor clientele, there is also almost no nonprofit money in those communities. So one example that I used in the most recent report is the disparity between the endowment for the Cleveland Foundation in Ohio versus the Mahoning Foundation, which is where Youngstown, which was the first daily to go dark, the major daily to go dark in this country, was located. And it is of a magnitude of hundreds times in terms of looking at billion-dollar endowments for these large community foundations that could throw off enough money to support a small newsroom or a small news operation, versus the ones in the economically struggling communities that never had amassed the endowment, and most of the money is going to community needs like homeless shelters or other sorts of things. So one of the issues too is also getting nonprofits and such as family foundations or community foundations to actually think about journalism as not just a public good, but a cultural good for us, because they're much more inclined to support the arts in a way that you would argue that journalism and news is an art form. And so it's very difficult, as you can imagine, to kind of shift over to thinking about journalism in the same realm. One of the other things that I've heard repeatedly from nonprofits is that you've still got to raise money if you're a nonprofit news organization. And often that comes with the same sort of strings we used to worry about on the for-profit side, which is that your grants come from certain foundations which have an interest in a certain specific topic. So it's not the general news coverage that you need. It's not supporting a reporter who goes out to sit through what can be mind-numbingly boring town council meetings or county commissioner meetings to come up with that one story that makes a difference.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I have more, but I will turn it over to Scott Shapiro at this point. Again, thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being on the show, but also for the work that you do. I mean, it's unbelievably informative and valuable, and I'm so glad that somebody's doing this really important work. I have a very easy first question and then a much harder second question. So let me ask the easy question first. I was wondering if you could tell the listeners what the role. I mean, you started talking about it in your response to Sandy, but the role that private equity has played in the dismantling of local journalism and the creation of news deserts and ghost newsrooms, and don't hold back.
Okay, well, let me try to be back up just a little bit and at least use some degree of scholarship in answering this question. So, whatever you can say about the media barons of the previous century, whether they were private or whether they were publicly traded, the very best ones valued, at least tried to value the civic journalism mission as much as the profit mission. And their whole notion, when I was at the New York Times, for instance, the word was no good news organization was ever strong for long if they were not profitable, right? So you had to make enough money to sustain the news organization. The good thing about publicly traded companies is that I could make a decision because of the transparency that was involved in that of which news organization I wanted to support. So if I was really keen on what the New York Times or the former Knight Ridder chain was doing, I bought Knight Ridder stock. If I cared more about profit, I might choose another stock. I'm going to not name any right now, but I might do another one, right? And so what happened in the late 1990s is that newspapers returned, had a higher rate of return than even the S&P 500 for total shareholder return. So what you had is you had a bunch of institutional firms say, gee, this is a good hedge, right? This is a consistent earnings thing. I'm going to just start buying up newspaper stock. And suddenly you turn around and many media companies had much more than 50% of their stock owned by these outside institutional investors who could move, they'd own 5% shares. They would, the minute they got over 5, some of them accumulate 10, 15. And you had 3 or 4 who had almost a majority and they could link up together. Well, beginning in 2000, print advertising revenue basically started falling off the cliff. It took 50 years to reach a peak. It was 2000 was the peak. And between 2000 and 2010, it dropped down below 1950 levels. So you can imagine a kind of a slow move up and then just a dramatic falling off the cliff. So what happens is you've got all these institutional investors who've been sitting back thinking, hey, this is great. I don't have to worry about newspapers. Those dinosaurs will keep throwing off the profits. And then by 2005, 2006, they begin to think, yes, I'm seeing digital move in. Classified's gone away. Something's beginning to really bother me. And they start pressuring these companies to sell themselves, split themselves up, and the like. And so you begin to have companies like a McClatchy, like a Lee Enterprise, to decide they're going to go in and they're going to buy newspapers, right? And continue to accumulate them because they're still working under the notion that newspapers are going to survive, even though, and they think the bigger they are, the better they are positioned to survive. And then, of course, the recession comes in 2008. So what happens is that if you were going to buy a newspaper in the early days of 2008 that was in a good market, you were going to pay 13 times annualized earnings. So think about that for a moment. If you're going to buy a newspaper, you're making a commitment to that community for at least 14 years, theoretically, in order to get your money back. So you're not going to go in, strip it for parts. Within a matter of months, by the beginning of 2009, the price of buying a newspaper in most markets had fallen to 3 times earnings. So think about it. It's like having a mortgage on a house that's underwater, right? So if you're Lee and you're McClatchy, suddenly you have huge debt for papers that are no longer worth what you paid for them. And at the same time, you have other chains, large chains, that had gone on and made this, and they had to declare for bankruptcy. So what you had is these private equity and hedge funds that had been investing, and even pension funds that had been investing in newspapers as kind of passive investors. All they'd ever do is kind of lobby for seats on the board to get you to sell or something. Suddenly they can go in and not just be passive investors. They can actually own and show the rest of us just how we're going to reform newspapers the same way we reformed gadget factories, right? So we're going to go in, we're going to strip costs, we're going to get them back to profitability, and then we either harvest them or we flip them, right? You can do that with if you pay 3 times earnings, you can flip it in 3 years. You can actually cost cut your way, theoretically, to profitability in a year, and then pass it off to somebody else or just harvest it. The problem is the print advertising has continued to fall. It has not hit bottom yet. And as I explained earlier, even though the print model has fallen off the cliff, there hasn't been a digital model that replaces it. So, and again, you think about it, these private equity companies, these hedge funds came in, their sole goal is not civic journalism's mission, but it's return for the shareholders. And you have two ways to play this. One, you go in for 3 to 5 years and then you try to flip everything. And so we've had a number of private equity companies that have done that. Over the past, between the years 2004 and 2014, more than half of all newspapers changed hands. Of what was almost 9,000 newspapers at the start of 2004, more than half changed hands at least once, and another third of those changed hands, or another half of those changed hands 2 times or more, and often within a year or two. So again, not only are you getting bigger and bigger and bigger chains with no connection to the community that you're in. So the largest chain today is more than 600 newspapers, whereas the largest chain in 2000 was 100 or so. So it's 6 times that size, and it's spread all over, 38 states or something. So I mean, it is a huge conglomerate with no connection to the small newspapers and the publishers who are down there, who often go in and out, and the papers often get traded. So, and think about this, every time it gets traded, that lessens another tie. So there's another publisher coming in, another editor, and some poor journalist who got cut off is now, applying at another place or freelancing or no longer covering it. So you've had all of that combination, and you've had half of them, the private equity companies have said, okay, we're in here, we got a good deal, we flipped it to somebody else, we're out of here, we're moving on to other distressed properties. And then you've had the other private equity firms who've said, well, things are going south, so the best way to do it is just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we'll consolidate. And so first you start with back office functions, then you move into things like circulation and distribution, then you move into advertising and sales, and then you also say, well, gee, why do we need all these editors? Let's just consolidate all these editors in one city and make them responsible for dozens of newspapers. that they edit every night, not knowing whether the story that was written about a town council meeting in one small town in, I don't know, let's pick Arkansas, for example, it actually accurately reflects what actually went on there.
That's an amazing, unbelievably distressing story. One quick question, unfortunately, it's unbelievably difficult, which is, let's say, let's say hypothetically, we get a President Biden with a Democratic House and Senate, let's say,
right?
Okay, hypothetically. What can they do? Quick, just like one or two ideas that might help with these problems.
Well, there are actually a number of ones that are floating out there right now and have been considered. I think that we need to think first and foremost, what are we trying to address real quickly? And one of the things that we're trying to address is the loss of journalists, right? So if there is some sort of tax policy, some sort of incentive that you can give to cover those for news organizations, regardless of whether it is a television station, whether it is a digital site, whether it is a newspaper, to cover what the FCC identified as 8 critical information needs around education, environment, health, governance, politics, infrastructure, economic development. I'm missing one and I don't know what it is, but I'm sure it was vitally important, or the FCC wouldn't have picked it. Oh, it was public safety. How could I forget in a time of COVID, right? So if you could get them to think in that term, that might be a way to begin to address what is not being missed. But I think it needs to be tied to, you don't want a tax credit used. I'm sorry, I enjoy a game of college basketball as much as any Tar Heel fan does, but you don't want it used to cover a college basketball game unless you're looking into the whole finances and other types of things that go on with education. So, I mean, I think that is one thing you can think about in terms of addressing that. You also, though, want to make sure that you're actually covering communities that have lost that. How is it being structured to do that? But that's one start. The second thing is we can really look at what kind of influence these large chains actually have. I mean, we're using 20th century metrics to look at household penetration and the like. That is not going to really address what type of influence is left by a chain that can still pull in, from 600 communities, millions of eyeballs through that, and millions more through their digital enterprises too.
Well, thank you. Thank you ever so much. And I'm going to turn questioning over to RonNell.
Thanks, Penny. This is all really helpful and also discouraging, but motivating for this group that is devoted to thinking about solutions. One of the things that we've been doing here is really trying to address sort of the confluence of a whole bunch of different streams of things that are happening at once that brought us to the moment we're at, the social, the cultural, the political, the economic. And I want to tap into a really specific stream that I think is important to this conversation, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. Right. We all here have sort of speculated in recent conversations that that's having a massive impact on the contours of this problem from both directions, both from the sort of quite sudden collapse of the already deteriorating ad revenue side of things, but also maybe on the other side of things in terms of illustrating for us the kind of demand that there might be for localized, useful, local and state information on matters of public concern, and sort of where the gaps are in real news gathering, and where those news deserts and ghost newspapers that you describe, the existence of those might be sort of creating real harm to real people. But all of the conversations that we've had about that have been largely anecdotal. We speculate that those two things on both sides of that are true. And I'm really eager to, while we have the expert with us, to sort of see if you can chime in with any hard data or any expert observations about the impact that the pandemic has had, and the ways in which it might have shifted us sort of tectonically rather than the incremental movements that we were seeing before it.
Well, look, as I mentioned in the report, you know, there were fissures already there. All you needed was a mild earthquake to open up the earth. And we got that with the COVID-19. I mean, the shutdown in March, I have heard from numerous publishers that in the second quarter, which is often the second best quarter for most newspapers, that their advertising revenue was down anywhere from 40 to 50%. From that. What saved them was the payroll protection plan. If that one has not been renewed, then they're also looking at even more extensive furloughs, layoffs, and the like, if there's not something that takes them through. And most of them are now looking to say they will not recover to February levels even. They think it will be at least 2 years. So even the best, the strongest are beginning to do contingency planning on that. So that is very immediate, and also a very immediate need, I think, in terms of policy that could be addressed quite quickly. The second thing I would say is that I think it also exposed where we had ghost newspapers and where we didn't. And let me get a real personal example here. As I mentioned before, I live 88 miles outside of Chapel Hill. I am actually in the poorest county in the state. Next door is the second poorest county in the state. Well, sometimes it manages to eclipse us and grab the prize. It has the largest population of Native Americans east of the Mississippi. It also has I-95 running right down through it. So you could almost see a progression between March and April of everybody fleeing to Florida out of the tri-state area down here, and it started moving in across the state. Now, the problem is the newspapers that were owned in both of these counties, all the way up to the Charlotte suburbs, is one of those that's owned by a private equity company that has been flipped 3 and 4 times. There's nothing really left except the poor reporters who try diligently their best, but they're usually straight out of journalism school and do not know how to get access to the data. The way I relied on data, and I would say that I'm a pretty aggressive gatherer of data just based on what my professional history has been. So I became immediately concerned about how do I know how the virus is spreading in North Carolina? How can I track it? So first thing I did is I looked at the New York Times. Then I started noticing that Johns Hopkins had a different one that was looking at it. Finally, what I did was rely on the 2 independent papers on either end of these 2 counties that are still owned by people who invest in good reporting, still keep their civic mission first and foremost. But what they had to do was form an alliance with other news organizations to actually get a lawyer to get the local public health county public health person to release the data. And what I immediately noticed when they were getting the data from their 2 places was the New York Times was running 3 weeks behind on its data, and that Johns Hopkins was running anywhere from a week to week and a half. So if you wanted to stay up to date on the COVID, I had to do a triangulation, and I was lucky because I knew where to look. And you could see the spread in North Carolina, you know, weeks before it actually became the headline story in early June as to what was going on here, right? I mean, but it's kind of it's a notion that you've got to have both the passion for wanting to get the truth, and you've got to have the available resources or think creatively about how you patch those resources together, as they did, which was bringing together 13 other news organizations to basically finance the lawyer who went to court with a Freedom of Information Act to basically get them to release the data.
Wow, that's it's a really helpful illustration of the scope and the impact of the problem. I have one last question that's a little bit esoteric, but it taps into a theme that we've talked about a lot here. And I really just want you to try to comment for us about maybe the evolving meaning of a community. Because it seems to me, I mean, we've talked a lot about the sort of those sort of glory days where everything was aggregated. The repeatage and the reportage was all happening in one place, and
Right.
the people would in fact subscribe to the local newspaper just to get the college basketball or football, and then on their
Right.
way to that, they would stumble upon being informed citizens in a democracy about information on matters of public concern related to the school board or public health or something else. And now we see that aggregation and the breakup, and particularly some of the social media trends that you described in terms of the grabbing of ad revenue. And I just wonder whether we've come so far in that time period that you've just described that our individual sense of community has shifted, that maybe our communities are no longer geographic. They're not about the city we live in or the state we live in, but rather the interest group that we galvanize around on Facebook or elsewhere. And is that among the things that we need to be talking about in this group? And if so, like, what are your thoughts about whether we need to try to rebuild those communities, or whether we need to sort of take the definition of community as the citizenry has handed it to us and build upon it?
Well, as Jack knows, I've been talking for more than 10 years about the two types of communities we have that the digital age has enabled. One is geographic community, the other is special interest. And I would put the social media in the special interest category. The other point I would also make, though, is geographic, even in this digital age, remains massively important. That is the way we think about ourselves as government entities, right? Whether we're a county, whether we're an incorporated city, whether we're unincorporated, or even what zip code we're in matters in the way that we think about policy and the like going forward. So I think what's very interesting is a lot of the some of the work that we've started doing too with the various I hate to use the word because it sounds so business school-ese, but the ancillary products that newspapers are actually putting out. And one of the studies we did was on this independent newspaper in the adjacent county, The Pilot, which has come out with two newsletters. One was aimed at millennials, and it's basically about what's going on. Here's what's happening. So it is fun and it's sassy, written kind of like the Skim. The other is the Pilot Briefing, which is a daily newsletter that tells you it tracks COVID-19. That's where I go to get all my information. And in a way, it has become, for some people, I think it has become a substitute for the paper. But we went in last spring to look at how your feelings about your community, how your identification with the geographic community was different between the two newsletters. And what we found is that subscribers to those newsletters, which in both newsletters are subscribed to at twice the rate of the newspaper now, the print newspaper, what we found is that the demographics were very, very consistent. The Pilot was slightly older, but there were an equal number of people who were retired reading to see what was going on in the community as you had the millennials and Gen Xers reading it. And that there was a different type. They used the same words in the broad sense to describe the community, but depending on how you, what you read, you saw a different aspect of the community. So I think it's very fascinating to start thinking about community as it relates to what is the news it's not the product, but what is the manner in which you get the news? I mean, is the digital newsletter really what is the next step for a newsletter, right? How is a digital newsletter different from a print newspaper? Does it serve different audiences, and how does it then engender that critical sense of geographic community that you need if you're going to have any political influence going forward?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Penny, I have one last question for you, and I don't know if it's a softball question or a hardball question, but it's a good way to end our interview. Suppose that you were approached by an entrepreneur who was civic-minded and wanted to make sure that there was a good newspaper in a mid-sized city. It could be in the Midwest, where I'm from. It could be in the South, where you're from. But they come to you and they say, you're a media economist. You know all this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm willing to put some money down, and I don't just want to make money. I actually want to do some public good. What advice would you give that person?
Here's what I see, and I'm glad you asked it. It actually is a softball question because I've seen it quite a few times. We're lucky in that there have been isolated instances of local communities and of entrepreneurs in local communities who've decided they wanted to buy back the paper from a private equity firm and were actually successful in doing that, or that they wanted to raise the money to buy the paper that was about to go bankrupt and keep it going. And what every one of them would tell you is that if you're going to do that, make sure you have enough capital to keep it going for 5 years. Because the initial investment is merely the notion of setting it up and buying it, or of starting a digital news operation, that what you're going to have to do in order to survive is realize how quickly the economics are changing. You're going to need to be able to have money set aside to test, to decide what works and what doesn't, and to move quickly. So what is so impressive to me about the iPad example that we started with is that he actually invested 1.5 years in testing to see what actually made sense. He wrote me earlier this week to say he's struggling in one market where they want very much to keep a daily presence, but they have not gotten up to the level that they need in terms of retaining print subscribers or enticing them to subscribe to the iPad. And that isn't, of course, an economically struggling community. So, I think there are a lot of hard decisions you have to make, but you have to approach it as a 5-year investment at a minimum, with enough capital, not just to buy the newspaper, but then to invest.
Would you turn the newspaper immediately all digital? Would you transition?
It would depend on the community. It would depend on the community and who I'm going to be disenfranchising if I did it. I think the other thing we need to realize is that we're creatures of habit, and you don't want to alienate your current loyal readers, but you do need to build a new generation. That's why I'm so interested in how the community identity that was engendered by these digital newsletters that was done by the small twice weekly just up the road from me.
RonNell has one last question.
Okay.
No, I asked it. Thanks. I got it.
All right, very good. Well, Penny, thank you so much for being with us today. We have learned a great deal from you. So
thank you. Great questions. I learned a great deal from you guys, so thank you.
All right, thank you very much.